international community expresses concerns over North Korea's nuclear program at the 10th NPT Review Conference at the United Nations. U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken also says Pyongyang is preparing for a nuclear test. South Korea is expected to report the biggest COVID-19 daily caseload since mid-April. As of 9 p.m. Monday, more than 100,000 new cases have been confirmed, more than double the day before. Tensions continue to build as U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi continues her Asia trip with a stop in Taiwan possible. China warns of retaliation while U.S. also says she has every right to visit Taiwan.
Good morning and welcome to New Day at Arirang. We begin with a review of the Keystone Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty opening at the United Nations. Countries expressed grave concern over the threat posed by a potential nuclear test by North Korea.
Nations, including Germany and France, call for putting an end to the regime's nuclear ambitions. In addition, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida promised to provide funds to promote education on the impact of atomic bombs with visits to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kim Yo-sun starts us off.
The international community has expressed concerns over North Korea's nuclear program at the 10th NPT Review Conference in New York. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken highlighted Monday that the world faces a critical moment amid fears of a potential North Korean nuclear test.
As we gather today, Pyongyang is preparing to conduct its 7th nuclear test.
This comes as Washington and Seoul believe that the regime has completed preparations for a nuclear test, which could come at any time. Seoul's Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs Ham Sang-uk stressed that addressing issues surrounding North Korea's nuclear program are of great importance. Speaking at the meeting held at the UN headquarters, he also criticized the regime for being the only country in the world to abuse the NPT scheme to publicly develop its nuclear weapons. Germany's top diplomat also called for a continued push to end the North's nuclear ambitions.
North Korea's nuclear weapons program. That means pushing for the complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of the North Korean peninsula and the implementation of all relevant UN Security Council resolutions.
On the same day, the U.S. and allies, including Britain and France, also urged Pyongyang to halt development of nuclear and missile capabilities in accordance with UN Security Council resolutions. The officials also expressed concerns over threats posed by Iran as well as Russia. Blinken noted that the landmark NPT agreement is, quote, under increasing strain due also to the actions of Russia. Attending the meeting, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida urged the international community to join forces to realize a world free of nuclear weapons. As the first Japanese leader to attend the conference, he said Tokyo will contribute $10 million to set up a special UN fund to help young people learn about atomic bombs through visits to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two Japanese cities that were devastated by U.S. atomic bombs in August 1945. He also called on nuclear states to enhance the transparency of their nuclear arsenals. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea's defense chief seeks to get Seoul's military intel sharing pact with Japan back on track. For the past 5 years during the past administration, Geopolitical has been stagnant due to bilateral issues that remain unresolved. Peunji has more.
Seoul's Defense Minister Lee Jong-seop called for a normalization of an agreement known as Geopolitical that enables South Korea and Japan to share military information. He said the government will undertake a comprehensive review to find the right time to do that, when asked about the issue by an opposition party lawmaker during a parliamentary session on Monday.
We aim to normalize Geopolitical, but at the right time, as we check up on relations between South Korea and Japan.
He also vowed to respond sternly in case of direct nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. His remarks come as Seoul seeks to tighten the security cooperation with Washington and Tokyo amid growing nuclear and missile threats from Pyongyang. Geopolitical enables South Korea and Japan to share information about North Korea's military and nuclear activities directly with each other. without going through their mutual ally, the U.S. The pact is widely considered to have been underutilized since 2019 because of unresolved issues regarding trade and wartime forced labor. Former presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung, who now represents Incheon's Gaeangbi district, took part in the session for the first time.
Diplomatic and security issues should not be brought into the political arena. I will also work to ensure we are never a country that surrenders or is forced to give up sovereignty.
Regarding North Korea, Lee Jae-myung stressed the importance of peace and the country's strong defense capabilities. 배은지, Arirang News.
The nation's top diplomat reiterated that Seoul will take part in strengthening the US-led alliance in semiconductors. However, the foreign minister emphasized that it is not going to exclude a certain country in the process. Kim Da-mi has the details.
South Korea is going to go ahead with its participation in the US-led semiconductor and supply chain cooperation framework, but only in a way that does not ostracize a certain country. Seoul's Foreign Minister Park Jin was talking about the so-called Fab 4 in a plenary session Monday of the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee of the National Assembly.
The U.S. proposal is focused on industry and does not target or exclude China. The U.S. also understands that Korea has close economic ties with China.
Park was referencing the widely held idea that the chip alliance is yet another way for the U.S. to keep China in check through an alliance in the semiconductor field between participating countries like Japan and Taiwan. Seoul's top diplomat then reiterated that he will do his best to ensure that Beijing does not misunderstand the purpose of the pact. That's also in line, he said, with Seoul's participation in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, better known as IPEF. South Korea's foreign ministry made sure to underline that Seoul will continue to communicate with non-participating nations, including China, based on the principles of inclusiveness, openness, and transparency. Also on Monday, Unification Minister Kwon Young-se reiterated that South Korea's 2019 decision to repatriate 2 North Korean fishermen against their will was clearly wrong. To prevent the recurrence of similar cases in the future, Kwon said he plans to suggest to President Yoon Suk-yeol that Seoul consider a policy of accepting all North Korean defectors. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
South Korea recorded a trade deficit for the 4th straight month, the first time that's happened since the 2008 global financial crisis. Last month's deficit came to around $4.7 billion. Exports were the highest for July, but that was outweighed by the soaring cost of energy. Shin Na-young helps us look beyond the digits.
South Korea's imports in July exceeded exports for a 4th consecutive month. It's the first time there has been such an extended deficit since 2008. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy announced on Monday that the deficit in July came to around $4.7 billion. Exports rose 9.4% on year to almost $61 billion, the highest amount for any month of July, thanks to strong outbound shipments of petroleum products and semiconductors. But imports were even higher. Imports jumped 21.8% to an all-time high of just over $65 billion due to skyrocketing energy prices.
Imports of energy in July rose to an all-time high of $18.5 billion due to soaring energy prices and growing demand for energy in summer, resulting in a trade deficit.
Energy wasn't the only factor behind the deficit. The country imported around $6.7 billion worth of semiconductors, up 25% from a year earlier. Imports of agricultural products rose about 22% to about $2.5 billion, with corn rising the most at 50%. One expert says this is because of a trade structure wherein about 40% of the goods Korea exports are made out of materials imported from other countries. He projects another trade deficit this month, but says it will get smaller toward the end of the year.
In the second half of this year, the trade deficit will decrease because the country's exports usually grow in September and October. But with raw material prices still soaring and global supply chains disrupted, the trade balance is less likely to turn into a surplus.
In the meantime, the government's planning to announce measures this month to help companies better compete overseas with their exports by cutting red tape. 신하영, Arirang News.
The Bank of Korea appears likely to raise interest rates again, this time by 25 basis points, as it tries to tackle inflation. The nation's central banker, when questioned by lawmakers in Parliament on Monday, said that would be an appropriate move, with higher rates being inevitable to prevent the damage inflation could cause to the broader economy. Lee Chang-yong added inflationary pressure will likely cool down in a few months as long as there's no major change to overseas factors like oil prices. In June, consumer inflation in South Korea came in at 6%, the highest in decades. That prompted the BOK to raise rates by an unprecedented 50 basis points. South Korea's ruling party admitted that it's in the midst of an internal crisis. The acting chair is stepping down. Support is growing for the PPP to adopt an emergency leadership system. Lee Young-eun has the details.
South Korea's ruling People Power Party is seemingly on course to launch a new interim leadership to pick up the slack resulting from its leadership crisis. It held a general meeting on Monday, and all of the attending members, except for one, agreed that the party is in the midst of emergency and it should act accordingly.
We discussed the party rule that enables us to switch to an emergency steering committee system in case an emergency occurs.
Under party rules, an emergency largely means when the chair position is vacant or when the Spring Council, which holds decision-making rights, can no longer function. Recently, the party has seen its chairman Lee Jun-seok suspended over a sexual bribery scandal. But since it technically still holds its position, the party can only declare emergency when its Spring Council is unable to function. In fact, the party is getting closer to that state due to a series of party leaders stepping down. Though several members do still remain, most party members agree that the current situation is urgent enough to be called as emergency.
2 out of the 5 decision-making members resigned, and the chairman is currently in something of an emergency situation. Lawmakers largely come to agreement that the party is currently unable to make decisions properly.
Through the new leadership, the party is looking to resolve the latest setbacks, including the suspension of the chairman and controversy surrounding the full leader, including the leakage of his message between him and President Yoon. The party is set to call for a national committee meeting, which has the ultimate right to approve the launching of an emergency steering committee system. The key will be persuading the head, who has so far expressed concerns over the plan. Lee Young-eun, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. Continuing from our top story on North Korea's nuclear activities, on another front, countries are trying to pressure the North to guarantee basic rights for its people. Now, many may not know this, but one of the biggest differentiating factors between conservatives and progressive governments in South Korea is the two-sides approach to North Korea.
And one tangible piece of evidence to support this is the fact that last month, the Conservative Yoon government appointed a new envoy for global cooperation on North Korean human rights. And this particular post, established in 2016, had been vacant for the last 5 years of the former Moon Jae-in government. So before we get any further, we have none other than the newly appointed envoy, Professor Lee Shin-ah, who's also teaching political science at Korea University. She joins us today to discuss her new role further. Very good morning to you, Professor Lee. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And
Thank you for having me.
First of all, we're very excited to hear that this position has been restored, as are many global observers. So could you first explain to us what your job entails, and as many may not know yet, what kind of authority or responsibilities you have as South Korea's global coordination envoy for North Korean human rights?
Okay. Well, to begin with, my title, actually my exact title is not only the North Korean Human Rights Ambassador, but the Ambassador of International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights. It's a rather long title, but this ambassadorship is one of a few non-resident unpaid ambassadorship for foreign affairs under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. that assigns the title of ambassador to persons with expertise and recognition in each field, like such as the human rights, things like this, or climate change and global security, so that they can engage in diplomatic activities. So for my job, core issue of North Korean Human Rights Act that was enacted in 2016, that includes the appointment of the ambassador and the establishment of the North Korean Human Rights Foundation, and so on. So the first ambassador of this job was appointed in September 2016, but since then no one was appointed in consideration of the inter-Korean relations after 1-year term under the Moon Jae-in administration. So for the first time in 5 years, I was appointed to fill this position. That was last week.
Right, now let's get deeper into your perspective as you take on this role. Do you think there needs to be a harsher stance taken on the Kim Jong-un regime, especially when it comes to protecting the rights of North Koreans?
Let me answer this way. As we know, the promotion of human rights is a universal value of humankind that should not be compromised for any reason, including the nature of the regime or its political purposes. So in broadly speaking, in that perspectives, the direction of this job should be considered into two major big factors. On one hand, accountability. On the other hand, the international involvement. The first, accountability, is to record the human rights situation in North Korea and preserve it as an official document. This is to make it possible to use in the future, even if it is impossible to investigate or punish the perpetrator or person in charge right now. And I believe it can be a good warning to those who perpetrate human rights violation. As you may recall, according to the report of the UN Commission of Inquiry in COI, human rights violation by North Korean regime and the issue of accountability are clearly stated in that report. The second is the international involvement or international engagement that also have two aspects. One is assertive involvement with the international community, including the United Nations. The Korean government should take an active and leading role in internationalizing or globalizing the North Korean human rights issue with a consistent stance on the protection of human rights as a universal value for the mankind. As you may know, the Korean government has been silent on the UN resolution on human rights in North Korea for 3 years from 2019. I think this was a shame. Therefore, I welcome and support Minister Park Jin's statement that Korea government will co-sponsor resolution on North Korean human rights issue at this year's UN Human Rights Commission. Another aspect of international engagement is a so-called constructive engagement with North Korea. That means to include the humanitarian aid to the North Korea's international engagement activities. If we emphasize only the accountability described above, the relationship with North Korean may become strained and nothing can be done. So I believe the goal is to find the optimal point for human rights improvement by appropriately mixing sanctions and support under the firm principle of accountability. Because improving the practical standard about living of North Korean ordinary people is a very important way to promote human rights. Of course, I mean humanitarian aid to the extent that it does not violate UN and international sanctions against the North Korean due to the North Korean nuclear issue.
Well, Ambassador, it sounds like there's quite a number of things on your plate. I mean, very unfortunately, human rights violations in North Korea is systematic and very much embedded all across society, beginning with civil rights and, of course, political prison camps. But are there any particular areas of North Korea human rights that you wish to tackle or focus on as a priority area?
First is the first is at the domestic level. I think I would like to join the efforts to launch the North Korean Human Rights Foundation. Although the North Korean Human Rights Act of 2016 I mentioned specified regulations for its establishment, there is a big problem that it is still neglected. So establishing a foundation is implementing the law. So it's very important. For that, I think I would like to cooperate with the various government ministries and communicate with members of the ruling and opposition parties. And also the second is the international level. Cooperation with the United States is very important. At the US and Korean summit last May, the two leaders shared serious concerns about human rights in North Korea. In the case of the United States, since Robert King, who served as Special Envoy for Human Rights in North Korea from 2009 to 2017, pretty long time. As he resigned in 2017, it is still vacant. Excuse me. President Biden has not kept his promise to appoint a special envoy after taking office, and even if he does, the bill must pass the Senate. So I hope the U.S. can also appoint a special envoy as soon as possible to discuss ways to cooperate. And close cooperation with the United Nations is also essential. Even during the period when the position of ambassadors or special envoys for North Korean human rights were vacant in Korea and the United States, the United Nations continued to maintain the position of special rapporteur on human rights. As a matter of fact, new rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon began her term yesterday and will have her first meeting with me tonight, although it's online. So while the terms of the representatives of Korea and the UN have started similarly, I hope that the special U.S. envoy will be appointed as soon as possible for trilateral cooperation. So I would like to be vocal about this important issue.
Well, many international observers are very pleased to have seen that you have filled this position, Ambassador. So, well, we really wish you luck with everything. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and we hope to be able to speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much, and sorry about my coughing.
Oh, no worries at all. Have a lovely day. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that wraps up the first half of New Day at Arirang, but stick around because coming up in the second half, we cover
South Korea's chip makers investing billions of dollars in the United States. So what's in it for these IT giants, and what does it mean in the context of America's friendshoring policy? We're going to have some experts to find out, so stay tuned.
South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean new day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good, but right now, maybe this is forever.
Welcome back to New Day at Arirang. South Korea is expected to report the highest number of new COVID-19 cases in over 3 months on Tuesday.
The country saw 106,367 new infections as of 9 p.m. Monday, more than double the previous day's figure. The last time the number exceeded 110,000 was last April. The number of critically ill patients, meanwhile, is seeing a significant uptick, with Monday's figure standing at 287, almost twice as many as the same day last week. Experts say the number of severely ill patients may reach as high as 600 later this month, as such increases are usually seen 1 or 2 weeks after a rise in new infection numbers. With US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Asia tour underway, Washington says that it will not be intimidated by China or engage in a saber-rattling. That's according to White House National Security spokesman John Kirby, who told reporters that Beijing could escalate its response amid speculation that Pelosi could visit Taiwan. He added that the actions could include firing missiles near Taiwan or large-scale naval or air drills. He also made it clear that Pelosi has the right to visit Taipei. This comes as several Taiwanese media outlets reported that Pelosi was set to visit the island on Tuesday.
French President Emmanuel Macron vowed to further support Ukraine's grain exports along with other European partners. In a phone conversation held between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and his French counterpart on Monday, Macron welcomed the resumption of grain exports from Ukraine, as the first shipment left Odessa on the same day. It's the first time since Russia's invasion began 5 months ago that Ukrainian seaports have been opened. Macron also promised continued assistance for Ukraine's military as well as financial aid to help the country recover from the war.
It's now time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. South Korea's second largest tech company, SK Group, pledged an additional $22 billion to expand semiconductor production along with other high-tech sectors in America. Now, this came during a rare video call between the group's chief Tae-taeon and US President Joe Biden last week, and just a day before the US Congress passed a $280 billion chips and science bill that includes more than $52 billion dedicated to computer chips. Samsung, a week before the announcement, also happened to mention that it may pledge billions more to build 11 additional factories in Texas. Now we discuss the significance of these South Korean firms investing massively into the United States. What are the costs and opportunities? We discuss this today with Yang Yi-dong, Professor of Business Administration at Ewha Women's University, and Dr. J.R. Reagan, CEO of Idea Explorer. Very warm welcome to you both. And my first question going to you, Professor Yang. Now, this massive investment, additional investment of $22 billion in the US made by SK Group, why is it so significant at this point for America?
Well, first of all, we need to take a look at the breakdown of SK's investment in the United States, up to $20 billion. $15 billion will be focused on semiconductors, and $5 billion for the batteries, and $2 billion for bio. So BBC, which are the acronyms of those advanced technologies, such as in the batteries and bio and the semiconductor chips, those are the major targets of the United States government strategy of friendshoring. First of all, we need to understand the significance of the semiconductor industry in the global economy. Well, last year, the semiconductor industry has grown by more than 26%, up to $600 billion. And as for the current economy, semiconductors takes up about 8% out of the overall GDP and 20% of our overall export. So this is a very important, industry for both of United States and Korea. And why SK decided to invest in the United States? The major reason, as the MC mentioned, the United States is trying to materialize their strategy of friendshoring. And U.S. Congress is greatly cooperating with the strategy of the government. So last month, July 26th, the United Senate passed the CHIP Plus Act that provides a subsidy up to $52 billion to semiconductor companies. And also, they may provide about 25% of tax deduction for the investment in the semiconductor manufacturing facilities. And I do believe that this strategy, this decision for SK to invest $22 billion in the United States may cause some dilemma because, they heavily depend on China to run their manufacturing, the operations. But I think the SK has great plans to overcome this dilemma because China cannot expel all those manufacturing facilities from their own country because China has plans to they acquire up to 70% of semiconductor consumption within their internal manufacturing facilities. So it's not easy for Chinese government to expel all the manufacturing facilities just because they are, to cooperate with the United States government.
Right, and Dr. Reagan, well, the US Congress having finally passed this CHIPS Plus Act on Thursday, what opportunities lie ahead for the likes of Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix?
Yeah, I think that because of the way the supply chains are shaking out around the world, there's really a bifurcating. There's really becoming two choices, and they call it either a blue supply chain that's aligned to the West and aligned to the U.S. and Europe, and a red supply chain, which is more aligned to China and Russia and those sorts of things. And I think as those two supply chains shake out, there becomes more opportunity particularly for chip makers, as there's more of a reliance on a friend shoring or an ecosystem of friends to be able to produce those chips. So I think as it may lose out on opportunities for chips and some digital products in China, it becomes more open to ecosystems and markets in places like the U.S. and Europe that it maybe didn't have such a dominant share before. So I think it's a gradual shift. It's not an immediate shift to different markets, but becomes bigger as the supply chains get tighter and those ecosystems get closer together.
And Professor Yang, it's becoming more and more clear that it takes a whole ecosystem for these companies to be able to really work on the next generation chips, especially logic chips for South Korean chip makers. But what makes the US such an attractive production base for these South Korean companies? I mean, given the higher labor costs on top of the multi-billion-dollar investments that we're seeing.
Well, it's true that the United States may not be the good place in terms of efficiency, because as for the total cost of ownership, the United States is 28% more expensive than China and 22% more expensive than Korea and Taiwan. But we should keep in mind that still, the United States has absolutely significant influence in the advanced technologies such as semiconductors. Well, if you take a look at the ecosystems of semiconductors, well, we can think about the fabless and the foundry, in other words, the designs versus the manufacturing, the market sectors. So when it comes to the IP, intellectual properties for software or designs or equipment, the United States has a dominant influence up to 57% in terms of total market value. But when it comes to manufacturing, the Taiwan and Korea and Japan, even China is doing a very good job. And in this manufacturing market, the United States has taken out only 13% in terms of overall the market value. So that means the United States needs to keep the balance between the IPs and the design, such as the fabless, and the manufacturing. And who could be the right partners? Probably their allies, such as Japan and Taiwan and Korea. And the second reason for the attractiveness of the United States for the investment is they have prepared, as we already mentioned, a great incentives for the foreign investment in the United States. For example, the Hyundai Motors decided to invest about $10 billion in the United States, and the $5 billion is about the electric vehicles. And the Georgia state has promised to support about 1/3 as a subsidy to support the investment in the facilities of electric vehicles. And besides, they had prepared about up to 25% of tax deduction, even though the Korea provides only 8 or 12% for the tax deduction. So in other words, the Korean companies may feel more and more attraction for the investment either in the United States compared to the investment in Korea. And third reason is for the past 20 years, the attractiveness of investment in Korea has diminished, by the big scale. In the year 2000, the foreign investment, overseas direct investment, used to be about $21.5 billion. But last year, in other words, in 20 years, the overseas direct investment has increased more than 25 times. Now, last year, it almost amounted to $552 billion. So lots of companies have decided to invest in overseas rather than in Korea.
But Professor Yang, well, the question is, so it seems that there are many advantages to moving chip production to the United States for these South Korean companies. But does it make strategic sense, though, to do this at the risk of offending China, where most of SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics' chips are made?
Well, it's not just about the Korean companies who declared to reduce or cancel the investment plans. For example, the recent survey says that even EU, about 1/4 of EU companies have decided to reduce or withdraw their investment plans in China. And Samsung SDI, they closed their 2 factories for the battery pack facilities, and LG Electronics also shut down the 2 factories in China. But I don't think China will retaliate all these recent movements of EU or Korean, the companies to reduce or to cancel their investment plans, because, as I already said, China has plans to acquire up to 70% of the internal consumption from the internal manufacturing facilities. So it's not easy for Chinese government to expel all those manufacturing facilities of other countries from the inland, because this is the only way to increase their internal occupancy rate up to 70%. And the third reason why the Korean companies may deal with the recent strategy to invest more in the United States, because in the third quarter, the DRAM price will be reduced by 5 to 10%, and NAND flash price will be also reduced by 8 to 13%. That means due to the lackluster the economic growth in the third quarter. That means Korean governments can reduce their production in their the manufacturing facilities in China. So still have time to get adapted to this recent and very abrupt changes in international politics and also international supply chain restructuring, particularly for the semiconductors.
And Dr. Reagan, the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS bill, it of course earmarks a huge amount of money, a lot of incentives, tax waivers and all sorts of benefits for companies investing in plants and setting up shop there in the US. So would the US guarantee better market access or any particular benefits in return for Samsung and SK's rather massive investments?
Well, I think we're already starting to see the kind of access that they can have. I mean, they're getting all the way to the White House with conversations and being able to influence politics and investments. But also, it's the unique structure of the U.S. where there's also investments and tax relief and those sorts of things at the state level. And certainly Samsung is receiving those now as it's investing heavily in Texas. I think the CHIPS Act is really geared towards mainly American companies. However, it's opening the doors for chip manufacturers like Samsung and like SK in places that they normally would not have gone into the U.S. And I think that we'll start to see that trickle down to even more Korean companies as they start to build more advanced chips, systems on chips, AI on chips, and those things being manufactured and produced and designed in lots of different locations throughout the U.S.
And Dr. Reagan, what strengths do South Korean chip companies have at the moment, and how can they further build their leverage?
Yeah, certainly it's got a leverage in manufacturing. It takes a long time to build that ecosystem with academia, with industry, with government. And it's learned how to do that in a lot of different types of chips. And just recently, Samsung had announced that it has put into production 3 nanometer chips, which is the first in the world in production. Very difficult to do, requires a lot of expensive machinery, and it's done that quite effectively. So if you look at the advantage in one sense, it's that manufacturing prowess that it has, but also it's starting to learn how to really put more things on a chip. Advanced artificial intelligence and systems, and design those for particular industries, such as automotive and those sorts of things. So it's got a huge leap ahead in manufacturing. It's got a pretty big leap in terms of its design and foundries, and all of that means it's catch up for a lot of U.S. companies, which is why they're having such success in the U.S. right now.
And Professor Yang, the million-dollar or rather multi-billion-dollar question, do you think South Korea is going to join the Chip 4 alliance?
I think so. Well, there could be 3 major reasons behind this forecast. The first one is still the United States is the king in the semiconductor industry. The Chip 4, Fab 4 means the coalition among United States, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. The United States, again, is the king for the intellectual properties for the design, software, and equipment. And Taiwan and Korea doing a very good job with the manufacturing. And Japan also is one of the very superb, the player in the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Well, the American government has banned the export of the semiconductor equipment for the less than 14 nano semiconductors. And the top 4 players within this semiconductor equipment, they take up more than 70% of market share. And 3 of them are American companies, and 1 is a Japanese firm. So this American government decision makes absolutely critical impact on the export of the semiconductor equipment to China. Without equipment, you cannot manufacture semiconductors. That may impact on the Chinese plan to acquire up to 70% of semiconductors within the internal manufacturing facilities. Number 2, the American government is trying to get closer to Japanese, the companies that may impact on the strategies of Taiwan or the Korean firms. In other words, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, they are actually rivals against each other. If the American government is getting closer to Japan, that may cause some concerns or threats to Korea and Taiwan. Number 3, the American government used to they sue Japan a long time ago because of their conflict. So 1985, American government sued Micron, and that made absolutely critical damage for the Japanese semiconductor firms to reduce their market share from 49% to 10%. So from all this reason, I think the Korean government may have a strong incentive to join this Chip 4 coalition.
I see. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to wrap up. That was Yang Yidong, Professor of Business Administration at Ewha Women's University, and Dr. Joe Arirang, CEO of Idea Explorer. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The amount of shopping done online here in the nation increased on-year in June. According to Statistics Korea, this is mainly due to people paying for travels and leisure activities after distancing measures are lifted. Here's Choi Min-jung with a breakdown of the figures.
More people in South Korea are shopping online on the back of eased virus prevention rules. According to Statistics Korea, the value of online transactions for June stood at 16.8 trillion won, or around $12.8 billion US dollars. That is more than a 10% increase from the same month last year. Purchases of cultural items like concerts and movies more than doubled on year. Transaction values reached over $200 million, the highest since data was first compiled in 2017. Online sales of travel services also more than doubled. Statistics Korea says the increase follows the eased social distancing rules, as well as the lifting of mandatory isolation for inbound travelers. More people have also purchased food and beverages online due to its convenience. Most of the online purchases were made through mobile devices like smartphones and tablets. Mobile shopping took up 74% of the total online shopping transactions, jumping more than 3 percentage points. Its transaction value also increased nearly 16% on-year to around $9.5 billion. Despite online shopping overall recovering to pre-pandemic levels, direct sales made online to customers overseas dropped almost 60% on-year in the second quarter of 2022. Cosmetics were hit hardest. The fall on online sales overseas was mainly on the back of decreased sales of duty-free products. This was due to a large fall in sales to China. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
For a look at news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you as well.
Let's start in Myanmar, where the junta looked set to extend their rule over the country.
Well, that's right, Do-yeon. Myanmar's military has declared a 6-month extension to its emergency rule, citing the need for stability amid internal clashes. Now, speaking through state media on Monday, junta leader Min Aung Hlaing claimed that efforts to implement a peace plan have been stalled due to instability. The junta first seized power from democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi in February last year. The Nobel laureate is currently in detention on numerous charges. Now, since the coup, the country has been under a declared state of emergency, giving the military more powers to detain people. The military has promised to hold free and fair elections in 2023, although many doubt this promise. New Zealand is finally open once again. The country's borders fully reopened on Monday to visitors from all around the globe. New Zealand had closed its borders back in March 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It started the reopening process in February for New Zealanders returning from overseas, and since May, tourists from 50 visa waiver countries have been allowed to enter. And as of Monday, visitors and international students from all countries are now allowed to enter into the country. Cruise ships and foreign yachts can also dock in New Zealand's ports. Although quarantine measures have been removed, though, visitors will need to be vaccinated against COVID-19 and must take 2 COVID tests after arriving. A landmark surgery using virtual reality has separated 3-year-old twins who were conjoined at the head. Requiring nearly 100 medical staff, 7 surgeries and 33 hours of treatment, London-based neurosurgeon Nurul Owais Jilani guided a team in Brazil who performed the operations. It was complicated as the twins were born with fused brains and shared a vital artery. The Brazilian medical staff practiced for months using virtual reality. It was the first time in history that surgeons trained in separate countries while working together in the same virtual reality room. And in our final story, deaf people could soon see conversations play out in real time using smart glasses. The X-ray glass converts speech into subtitles that appear on a display attached to the glasses. Noted as the first of its kind, the product is connected to a smartphone app, which turns any speech picked up into text display. X-ray Glass has launched a public trial period with alpha testers to help improve the software. It's hoped that by the end of 2023, the glasses will have reached around 70,000 people and that new capabilities will include the ability to translate languages and work across different tones and accents.
Good morning. What a thundery night we had. Fierce thunder and lightning shook the capital region in Gangwon-do province overnight. Well, rain has tapered off in the capital for now, but northern parts of the Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do province are receiving heavy rain with 30 millimeters an hour and do expect to see more than 120 millimeters of rain in total. So a heavy rain advisory has been issued in those places while the heat stays with advisories. The humidity and murky skies are making things more uncomfortable. Meanwhile, rain will start again in the capital regions after lunch. Most parts of the country had a tropical night. We are starting out the day above 25 degrees Celsius in most areas. Then Daegu will see a high of 33 degrees Celsius. Daejeon and Gwangju going up to 32 degrees. Now it's going to stay hot, but we won't be seeing a major heat wave for the rest of the week. And this Sunday already marks Ipchu, the beginning of autumn in the seasonal calendar. So hang in there for a few more days. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up our newscast for this hour. We'll be back tomorrow for our Wednesday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks ever so much for joining us this morning, but do tune into Arirang News for updates throughout the day. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.